The crisp night air carried the scent of pine and rain-kissed soil as the carriage jostled over the rugged terrain. Inside, Evalina kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers twisting the embroidered edge of her gown. The fabric was rich, a deep crimson silk chosen not for her, but for what she now represented. A peace offering, a sacrifice wrapped in luxury, a human girl, offered to a beast, a werewolf. She swallowed hard, her throat tight as the fortress loomed ahead, its stone walls black against the silver moon. The moment she stepped past those gates, she would no longer be the cherished princess of Eldoria. She would be his, the alpha of the Blackthorn pack. A man whispered about in fearful tones, a beast who ruled the mountains with an iron will. Rhydian Blackthorn. She had never met him, yet his name had shaped her nightmares for weeks. But this was the only way. For years, her kingdom and the werewolves had been at war, their lands soaked in blood and vengeance. Too many had died. Too many fathers, brothers, and sons buried beneath the soil. A treaty had been the only way to stop the carnage. But treaties demanded sacrifices. And she was the price of peace. Her life was no longer her own. Her choices, her future, even her body now belonged to a man who had never asked for her. The horses came to an abrupt stop. Her father's knights dismounted, their armor glinting under torchlight as they hesitated even. They were afraid. A figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, broad-shouldered, cloaked at midnight. Evalina's breath hitched as she lifted her chin, trying to see past the dim glow of the torches. The man before her had a presence that made everyone shiver without a single word. His silver-gray eyes, sharp as a winter frost, locked onto hers. "Evalina of Eldoria," he said with his voice low, rough-edged, like the growl of something barely restrained. She willed herself not to shiver. "My lord," she answered, voice steady despite the way her heart pounded against her ribs. The Alpha's fearful gaze flicked over her. His wolf, driven too, stirred inside him. "Too fragile. She won't last a week here," came a voice from within him. Driven, the name of the beast, his wolf that lived inside him. Rhydian said nothing, only extended a gloved hand. Evalina hesitated before slipping her fingers into his. His grip was warm, calloused, a warrior's hand. As he helped her down, the touch sent an unexpected jolt through her skin, a current of something deep and primal. His gaze sharpened, but whatever he felt, he buried it quickly. "Come," he said simply. She was led past towering figures, his warriors. They watched her with unreadable expressions, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain. The tension in the air was suffocating. She had spent her whole life surrounded by nobles who bowed at her feet. Here, she was nothing but an unwanted bride, a human among wolves. But she would not cower. She walked beside her husband-to-be with her head high, even as she stepped into the unknown. The ceremony was held in the great hall, beneath the glow of flickering torches. The room was filled, not just with his warriors, but with her father, her mother, and the council of elders from both sides. Evalina stood still as the elder wolf, draped in ceremonial robes, chanted the ancient words that would bind them. Tonight, two bloodlines become one. Tonight, peace is sealed through union. The elder intoned. Her father watched from the corner, his face carved from stone, but she knew him well enough to see the grief buried deep in his eyes. Rhydian remained impassive beside her, his presence as unmoving as the mountains. A small, sharp blade was pressed into her palm, the sting barely registering as the elder guided her hand to press against Rhydian's. His blood and hers mixed. A pact stronger than words, stronger than paper. A bond, whether they wanted it or not. The silver band was slid onto her finger, heavy with meaning. A binding of hands. An exchange of words that felt hollow. The hall had emptied very soon as the ceremony ended, leaving only him, her, and the silence that stretched between them. Evalina stood in the candlelit hall, a wife to a man who barely acknowledged her presence. "Go to my chambers. I will come soon," Rhydian said at last. Do you despise this as much as I do? She asked, her voice quiet but steady. His jaw tightened, but his eyes revealed nothing. Evalina searched his face, looking for something, anything. I do what must be done, he said, as if marriage was just another duty, no different from leading a battle or making an alliance. Evalina exhaled slowly. She had known this would not be a love match, but some foolish part of her had hoped for something. Then I won't keep you waiting, she said, turning on her heel before he could see the way her chest ached. The chambers were vast, warmed by a roaring fire, yet the space felt unfamiliar. Too large, too empty. Evalina stood at the window, staring at the darkened forest beyond. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant echoes of wolves. A reminder that she was no longer in her world. She closed her eyes, breathing in deep. She would survive this. The door creaked open. She turned, expecting her husband. Instead, a woman stood in the doorway. Long, dark hair. Fierce golden eyes. A presence that felt almost predatory. My. So this is the human bride. The woman purred, stepping forward. Evalina's fingers curled at her sides. Who are you? A slow smile spreads on her face as she answers. Lyra. Your husband's true mate. The words landed like a slap on Evalina, but she forced herself to stay still, to not show her weakness. I see. Then why am I the one wearing his ring? She said evenly. Lyra's smirk faltered just slightly before she laughed. Oh, you're bold. That will be fun to watch when he tosses you aside. Before Evalina could respond, another presence filled the doorway. Rhydian. His gaze flickered between them, and for the first time, his expression was unreadable. You shouldn't be here, Lyra, he said, voice firm but lacking warmth. Lyra's eyes softened, her lips parting. Rhydian, but he cut her off in mid-sentence and said, Leave. A muscle in her jaw ticked as she nodded. But before she left the room, she stepped closer to Rhydian and pressed a slow, lingering kiss on his cheek. Evalina saw it, the flicker of something in her husband's eyes. Something unreadable. But he didn't pull away. Her stomach twisted. When Lyra had first called herself his true mate, a part of Evalina had doubted it. She had clung to the hope, no, the possibility that the woman was lying. That this was just another cruel way to make her feel out of place. But as she watched Lyra press her lips to Rhydian's cheek, and as he let her, the truth struck her like a blade to the heart. It wasn't a lie. This woman, Lyra, was his true mate. The realization settled like ice in her bones. Then, the question became, why marry me at all? Lyra smirked, glancing back to Evalina. I'll be waiting for you, my love. In our room, she murmured to Rhydian, before casting a pointed glance at Evalina. Then she was gone, leaving Evalina standing in the silence of her wedding chamber. Our room, not hers. His true mate was staying here, with them. When Rhydian turned to leave as well, she found herself speaking before she could stop herself. Are you spending the night with her? He paused, surprised, as if he hadn't expected her to ask. But then his voice came cold, indifferent. It's none of your business. She stared at him, unflinching. Then, I think it's my business to know why you married me when you have a mate. He sighed before he looked up at her. Because I had no choice, he said. Evalina's throat tightened. No choice. She swallowed as she replied. No. You clearly had a choice. You could defy the treaty. You're the Alpha. Why not refuse it? His jaw ticked, a muscle jumping beneath his skin as he said, looking at her. You think this is about you? Evalina flinched, but she didn't look away. Rhydian let out a quiet scoff. His expression remained the same as he continued. Your father came to me waving a white flag, princess. A fragile, desperate man, on his knees, offering his daughter, like a lamb to a wolf in a last attempt to stop a war he could never win. Her chest tightened. She knew the truth of those words. Her father had sent her here as a bargaining chip, a pawn to be traded in exchange for peace. But hearing it from Rhydian, hearing the sheer disdain in his tone, hurt in a way she wasn't prepared for. He took a step closer, making her look up at his handsome, stunning face. "Do you know what your kingdom has done to my kind? How many of my people they've slaughtered?" he asked. A sharp inhale caught in Evalina's throat. She didn't know. She had seen the aftermath of battles, heard the whispered confessions of guilt from knights who had returned bloodstained and hollow. "And yet," he continued, voice like a blade, "I agreed to the treaty. I agreed to marry you. Because unlike your kind, I do not break oaths." He ended, his words wrapped around her like an iron chain, sinking deep into her heart. Her hands clenched at her sides. "So that's all I am to you? A contract? A necessary evil?" His lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "You are my responsibility. Nothing more." He answered instead. A dull ache formed in the back of her throat. She hated how much those words stung. How foolish she had been. Some naive part of her had hoped that maybe, just maybe, there was room for something else. Not love, no. That would have been too much to wish for. But respect? Kindness? She had thought she could make this work. That if she tried hard enough, if she proved herself, he might see her. But now, on the night of their wedding, he was looking right through her. She lifted her chin, forcing the waver from her voice. "And what of Lyra? Is she anything to you, too?" A shadow passed through his expression, too fleeting for her to grasp. Rhydian exhaled slowly, as if her presence alone was exhausting him. "I already told you. It's none of your concern." Evalina nodded, trying to steady the unease rising in her chest. "She is staying here, isn't she?" Rhydian didn't answer. Lyra had already said she would wait for him. In their room, and that was the answer alone as he dismissed her questions without a second thought and said, "You will sleep here. I won't touch you. This marriage is nothing more than an agreement. Don't expect anything else." His voice was cold as he said it. She lifted her chin slightly, blinking rapidly as her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, refusing to let them fall. The words landed heavier than she expected. She had prepared for this rejection, but hearing it, feeling it was different, but she didn't let him see it on her face and replied, "As you wish, Alpha." Something unspoken flashed in his eyes for a second, just a heartbeat. But he said nothing, only turned on his heel and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Evalina sat still, staring at the empty space where he had stood. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the silence, but it did nothing to warm her. Her wedding dress, carefully stitched for this night, felt heavy against her skin. A symbol of a union that meant nothing. She had been given to a man who wanted nothing to do with her. And on the night of her wedding, her husband was with another woman. A tear slipped down her cheek. Then another. Not because she was weak, but because she was human. And humans, no matter how strong, could still break. The morning came with a sharp knock at the door. Evalina wiped at her face quickly, straightening her spine before standing. Her eyes burned from sleep she hadn't gotten, but she forced herself to appear composed. When she opened the door, a man stood before her. Not Rhydian. His features were softer, more inviting, with golden brown hair tousled, as if he had just run a hand through it. His dark eyes flickered with curiosity, always carrying a trace of mischief, as if the world amused him in ways others failed to notice. A smirk played at his lips, easy and boyish, making him seem far less intimidating than the wolves she had encountered thus far. Yet handsome in a way that was different from Rhydian. Where Rhydian was severe and striking, Tobias was warm and charming. Rhydian's features were all sharp angles, a strong jawline, high cheekbones, and silver eyes that seemed carved from ice. His presence was commanding, the kind that made a room hold its breath, his movements deliberate and powerful. Tobias, on the other hand, had an effortless allure. Golden skin kissed by the sun, dark lashes framing eyes that held more laughter than shadows. If Rhydian was a winter storm, Tobias was the lingering heat of a late summer afternoon, unpredictable yet inviting. His gaze lingered on Evalina just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably, his amusement deepening as if he had noticed. "Morning, Luna," he said smoothly, leaning against the doorframe. "Or should I say, princess? Which do you prefer?" Evalina stared at him for a moment, unsure of what to make of him. He was nothing like Rhydian, and yet he was still a werewolf. She swallowed before answering, keeping her voice steady. As you wish. Tobias's smirk deepened. Then I'll call you Princess. It'll make you feel at home. Something in his tone, light-hearted but sincere, made her chest warm. She had spent the last day feeling like an outsider, like something foreign and unwelcome, but Tobias spoke as if she belonged. You look like you've been through hell, he said, shocking her, but his smirk deepened as he said, Not the greeting you expected? Evalina blinked at him, admitting, voice hoarse from the night. I wasn't expecting a greeting at all. The man chuckled, shaking his head. Welcome to the pack, Princess. He held out a hand. I'm Tobias, Beta of the pack. And since our esteemed Alpha is too busy to do it himself, I've been assigned to make sure you don't get lost or eaten. Evalina hesitated before placing her hand in his. His grip was warm, firm. Eaten, she echoed. Tobias grinned. You're in a den of wolves, after all. He teased her that made something inside her ease. It was the first time someone had spoken to her without disdain or pity since she arrived. He said, gesturing down the hall. Come on. You must be starving. She was. But the idea of stepping out into a world she didn't belong in, facing the people who would rather see her gone, made her hesitate, and Tobias seemed to sense it. Stick with me, Princess. I'll make sure you survive the day, he said, his voice softer this time. She smiled before muttering, hopefully, and walked down the hall with him. The whispers followed her the moment she stepped into the grand hall. Werewolves, men and women alike, sat at the long wooden tables, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes flickering in her direction. Evalina lifted her chin, refusing to let the weight of their stares sink into her bones. Tobias leaned closer, muttering under his breath, Ignore them. They'll get over it. She let out a small breath, looking back at him asking, Will they? He grinned, shaking his head. Probably not. Despite herself, she laughed, quiet but real. Tobias pulled out a chair for her at the head table. Sit. Eat. Before they start thinking humans don't need food. He lowered his voice playfully. She smiled, sliding into the seat, and a plate was placed in front of her, filled with food she barely recognized. She hesitated, and Tobias nudged her, saying, It won't bite, I promise. Eat. Evalina gave him a look but took a cautious bite. The flavors burst on her tongue, richer than anything she was used to, but warm and oddly comforting. As she ate, Tobias spoke, telling her about the pack, the people, the land. He was easy to talk to, a stark contrast to Rhydian's cold silence. She found herself relaxing. Until Rhydian entered the hall. With her. His true mate by his side. Lyra. With her arm looped through Rhydian's. She was stunning as she glowed with confidence, her beauty effortless. The air shifted instantly. Conversations hushed, backs straightened. Evalina froze, her fingers tightening around the cup in her hand as her husband strode inside with Lyra. He looked every bit the alpha. Powerful. Unyielding. And then his gaze found hers. For a moment, he didn't speak and just sat at the head of the table beside her. He only took in the sight before him, his wife sitting with his beta, laughing. His jaw ticked. But before he could say anything, Tobias's voice rang out. Morning, Alpha. Tobias leaned back in his chair, one arm resting casually over the back of Evalina's chair as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Evalina turned her head to look at him in surprise, but Tobias simply smirked, lifting his cup in greeting. Rhydian's gaze darkened for a fraction of a second before shifting away. Lyra leaned into Rhydian, murmuring something that made her giggle softly, her fingers lingering on his arm. Then, with a graceful ease, she slid into the seat beside him, the seat directly across from Evalina. Tobias muttered something under his breath. Evalina didn't catch it. She was too busy watching the way Lyra's fingers brushed over Rhydian's wrist, the way she leaned in, speaking in hushed tones meant only for him. Evalina's appetite vanished. She swallowed hard and reached for her spoon, but her hand trembled slightly. Why was she here? Why was she still holding on to him? On their wedding night, and now in broad daylight, as if Evalina didn't exist. She pushed her plate away. Tobias noticed instantly. "You haven't eaten." His voice dropped low, so only she could hear. "I'm full," she murmured, rising to leave. But Tobias's fingers caught her wrist, stopping her gently by calling her by her name, Evalina. Her heart skipped a beat. Something about the way he said her name, soft, steady, grounding, made her heart stutter in her chest. It had been so long since someone had spoken to her like that, with care, with warmth. She swallowed, startled by the sudden rush of feeling. Had she forgotten what kindness sounded like? Beside her, Rhydian went rigid. His grip on his fork tightened, the scrape of metal against ceramic the only sign of his reaction. His silver eyes snapped toward them, toward Tobias, whose voice had come out far too soft, far too gentle. Something flickered in his gaze. It wasn't jealousy. It couldn't be. But it was there, a tightness in his jaw, a sharpness in his gaze, a shift in his aura that made the air feel heavier. Tobias, unbothered, leaned in slightly towards Evalina. "She's doing this on purpose. Don't let her win." Evalina blinked up at him, her lips parting slightly. He gave her a small smirk as he said, "Besides, if you leave, I'll have no one to suffer through breakfast with. And that's just cruel." She immediately laughed, which made Tobias smile. Rhydian noticed that too. And so did Lyra. And she didn't like it. The smile on her face faltered, her grip tightening around her coffee cup. Then, with a honeyed sweetness, she turned her attention to Evalina. "You must forgive me. I haven't had the chance to properly welcome you," Lyra said suddenly, her voice light and airy. Evalina blinked, uncertain. Lyra stood, picking up a glass of dark red wine. "Come, let's start over." She stepped toward Evalina, her smile never wavering. Evalina hesitated, unsure of what to say. Then Lyra tripped. The glass tipped, its contents spilling forward onto Evalina's dress. Gasps rippled through the hall. Evalina inhaled sharply, the cold liquid seeping into the fabric, staining the soft ivory of her dress with deep crimson. "Oh dear. I'm so sorry. I must have been careless." Lyra gasped, pressing a hand to her lips. Tobias's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his voice flat. "Right. And I'm the king of the East." Lyra turned to him, all innocence. "It was an accident." Tobias rolled his eyes at her as he replied, "Of course it was." Lyra's lips parted slightly as if surprised by his lack of belief, but she quickly masked it with a sweet smile. Evalina exhaled slowly, willing herself to remain calm. She would not cause a scene, but Tobias had already had enough. "Come on, princess. I had your things brought over earlier. You can change," he muttered, gently taking Evalina's arm. Evalina nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As Tobias led her away, Rhydian watched. His gaze lingered, following the soft curve of Evalina's face, the way her lashes lowered as she looked away, the delicate strength in her posture even as she walked through a room that wanted nothing to do with her. She was beautiful, and Lyra knew it, because when Rhydian's eyes didn't stray from Evalina, Lyra's fingers curled into fists. The afternoon sun painted the skies in soft gold and orange hues as Evalina urged her horse forward, her posture effortlessly graceful. The wind wove through her loose curls, the rhythmic gallop of her mare steady beneath her. It had been years since she had last ridden freely before her father had turned her into nothing more than a pawn to be traded away. But today, at this moment, she was simply Evalina again. A short distance behind, Tobias groaned in frustration, struggling to keep pace on his own mount. The big, powerful beta wolf in the pack looked comically uncomfortable atop a horse. "You're an awful rider," Evalina called out teasingly, shooting him a smirk over her shoulder. Tobias muttered something under his breath before huffing. "I don't usually ride horses, princess. I have 4 legs of my own for a reason." She laughed, slowing her mare just enough to let him catch up. "And yet, you look like you're about to fall off." Tobias grumbled, shifting in his saddle. His hold on the reins was loose, as if he had no intention of actually controlling the animal. Because I am. Why do humans insist on these things? Evalina rolled her eyes. Horses are faster than carriages, quieter than marching soldiers, and more elegant than running on foot. Tobias shot her a look. I can shift and cross this entire field in half the time. Evalina laughed. Yes, but can you do it while wearing clothes? He opened his mouth, then shut it, conceding with a lopsided grin. All right, you win this one. Their shared laughter drifted across the open fields, a rare moment of lightness. But from a distance, Rhydian watched, his posture rigid. Evalina looked different out here. Freer, stronger. And Tobias, his beta, his second in command, was too close. Driven, his wolf, snarled inside him. He's too close to her, and she's happy with him. Rhydian said nothing, but his grip tightened at his sides, his jaw set hard. Rhydian ignored it. Tobias had always been loyal. He would never cross a line. Would he? Because for the first time, he wondered if he had made a mistake letting her slip through his grasp so easily. Evalina slowed the horse to a gentle trot before dismounting with Tobias's help. He steadied her with a hand on her waist. Rhydian's patience thinned. Tobias, Rhydian called, his voice cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. Tobias sighed under his breath. Here we go. He turned, greeting the Alpha with a nod. Afternoon, Alpha. Rhydian's gaze flickered toward Evalina for the briefest moment, but then it was back on Tobias. Cold. Unforgiving. A word. Now. Rhydian said. Evalina frowned, but Tobias simply winked at her before following Rhydian a few steps away. The moment they were out of earshot, Rhydian turned on him, his silver eyes flashing. Why are you with her? His voice was low, dangerous. Tobias raised his brow, helping her adjust. She's human. She knows nothing about our world. Rhydian glared at him. That is not your place. Tobias scoffed. Then whose place is it? Yours. He let out a dry laugh before continuing. Because last I checked, you were too busy parading around with Lyra to even care about her. Rhydian's jaw clenched, tension rippling through his features. His wolf growled deep inside him as Rhydian replied, That is not your concern. Tobias's easy demeanor faltered, frustration seeping in. It should be yours. The words struck hard, but Rhydian refused to react. Tobias took a step closer. She didn't ask for this marriage. She was thrown into a world she doesn't belong in. And instead of guiding her, instead of making it easier, you ignore her. You let your mate humiliate her. Rhydian's eyes darkened. Watch your mouth, Tobias. Tobias snapped. No. You watch yours. She's your wife, Rhydian. But you treat her like she's nothing. Rhydian's fingers curled into fists, his wolf pushing against him, demanding he put his beta in his place. But Tobias wasn't finished and let his frustration out. You don't want her, but you won't let anyone else be near her either. You want her to suffer? Fine. But for how long? Until she breaks? Rhydian's chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, his silence more dangerous than his anger. Tobias exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You know what? Forget it. I have more important things to do than argue with you. He said, his voice was quieter now, tired. Rhydian's eyes narrowed. And what is that? A smirk ghosted over Tobias's lips as he answered, preparing for the ball tonight. Rhydian frowned, replying, That is Luna's responsibility. Tobias shrugged. She was supposed to be preparing, but I decided to take her out instead. Something in Rhydian's chest tightened, but he once again ignored it. Tobias took a step back, his smirk returning as he said, I'll take care of it. Since you won't. With that, he turned and walked away from him. By the time the sun had disappeared beyond the mountains, Evalina stood in her chambers, staring at the breathtaking dress spread across her bed. She reached out, brushing her fingers along the fine silk. No one had ever gifted her something so beautiful before. The door creaked open. She turned to see Tobias leaning against the doorway, watching her reaction with amusement. Do you like it? He asked. Evalina swallowed, still tracing the fabric. Did you? Tobias smirked, nodding. Who else? Her chest tightened. Not her father. Not her husband. But Tobias. She turned, meeting his gaze, smiling. Thank you. He grinned. Don't just stand there. Get dressed. We have a ball to attend, princess. He gave her a playful wink. Little did she know, tonight, all eyes would be on her, including those of a certain Alpha. The dress felt like a dream. Evalina stood before the tall mirror, fingertips grazing the smooth silk of the gown. The dress fabric shimmered under the candlelight, hugging her figure in a way that felt both foreign and beautiful. Tobias had chosen well. A quiet sigh left her lips. She wasn't naive. Tonight wasn't for her. It was for the pack. A spectacle. A show to prove that their Alpha had a Luna, even if that Luna felt like nothing more than a shadow. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned, expecting a servant. Instead, it was him. Rhydian stood at the doorway, his broad frame filling the space. For a moment, he didn't speak. His silver eyes, always so unreadable, traced over her form, drinking in the sight of her in the dress. Evalina's breath caught. The air between them shifted. It was strange, unnerving, to be studied by him like this. His usual coldness wavered, replaced by something darker, heavier. She swallowed as she asked, "Is it time?" He didn't answer. Not immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, the scent of pine and smoke curling around her senses. "You?" Rhydian's voice was low, almost reluctant. "You look beautiful," he said. Evalina's breath caught. Before she could react, his hands moved, strong, steady, wrapping around her waist. A soft gasp left her lips. Her body stiffened in shock, but he didn't pull away. His grip was firm, fingers pressing lightly against the silk of her dress, as if drawn to her despite himself. His silver eyes darkened. Evalina could barely think, barely breathe. The Alpha, the man who had only shown her cold detachment, was holding her. Her pulse thrummed wildly as Rhydian lifted a hand, his calloused fingers grazing her chin. He tilted her face up. Evalina's lips parted, heart pounding as he leaned in. So close. Too close. His breath fanned against her lips, his gaze flickering between her eyes and her mouth, as if fighting something, as if drawn in against his will. For a fleeting moment, it felt as if everything around them disappeared. As if there was only this. Only him. Only them. But just as his lips were about to brush against hers, a voice sliced through the moment. Rhydian. The moment shattered. The warmth of his hands vanished as he stepped back, as if burned. Evalina blinked, disoriented, her breath still caught in her throat. Had that really just happened? But the answer stood before her, tall, beautiful, and furious. Lyra. She was breathtaking. Long, platinum blonde waves cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face sculpted to perfection, high cheekbones, striking blue eyes, lips painted a soft shade of rose. She wore a deep red crimson gown, the fabric clinging to her curves before pooling at her feet like liquid fire. A vision of elegance and power. She knew it, too, and she saw everything. Lyra's lips curled into a soft smile, though her golden eyes flickered with something dangerous. "I was looking for you," she said, stepping closer. Without hesitation, she looped her arm through his. Evalina forced herself to look away. "Everyone might be waiting for you. Shall we go downstairs together?" she asked sweetly, her fingers tightening around his arm. But Rhydian didn't move. Instead, his jaw clenched. His silver eyes flickered to Evalina for a brief second before settling back on Lyra. "We can't walk down the stairs together, Lyra," Rhydian said, and Lyra stiffened, though her expression remained composed. His voice was steady, unyielding. "It's a pack ball. I have to walk with my wife." Evalina wasn't sure what surprised her more. The way he had said it without hesitation, or the way Lyra's entire body went rigid beside him. For a moment, the beta's words from earlier echoed in the back of his mind. "She's your wife, but you don't treat her like one. So why now?" Lyra blinked up at Rhydian, as if waiting for him to take it back. When he didn't, her smile faltered. But then, she laughed softly, a careful, measured sound. "Of course, Alpha. I understand," she said smoothly. But she didn't. She was furious. Evalina could see it in the way her fingers twitched slightly at her sides, the subtle way her jaw clenched before her lips curved into something resembling amusement. And then, she turned to Evalina, smiling as her voice broke the silence between them, smooth and sweet. Too sweet. That dress. It's lovely. It suits you. Evalina stiffened. A compliment? From her? Then, Lyra's smile widened, her voice carrying a note of innocent curiosity as she asked, I saw Tobias with it earlier. Did he personally get it for you? Evalina froze. Personally? Where did that come from? Why would my beta be the one choosing dresses for my wife? Rhydian asked as his wolf growled inside him. And from the way Rhydian's entire body went rigid and his grip on her waist disappeared. Then, she knew the words had hit their mark. Evalina swallowed hard. This wasn't what it looked like. Tobias had been nothing but kind, a friend in a world where she had no one. But now she could feel Rhydian's fury seeping into her skin like poison. Evalina turned, only to find herself staring at Rhydian's hardened face. His silver eyes, once stunned by her beauty, had darkened into something else entirely. Is that true? He asked coldly. Evalina opened her mouth, but Lyra was already smiling, as if enjoying the storm she had just created. I'm sure it was a sweet gesture, Lyra added, eyes twinkling with mischief. Beta Tobias has always been kind, hasn't he? She asked, smiling. Evalina swallowed. She knew what Lyra was doing. And worse, it was working. Rhydian's jaw tensed, the muscle ticking in irritation. Without another word, he turned away. Evalina barely had time to react before his hand gripped hers firm. Let's go, he muttered. And just like that, she was being pulled down the stairs. Evalina didn't look back, but she could feel Lyra's eyes burning into her back. She barely kept up with Rhydian's strides as he led her down the grand staircase. His grip was tight, unrelenting. His face, sharp with barely leashed irritation, was turned away from her, but the tension in his jaw and the rigid line of his shoulders spoke volumes. Lyra had done exactly what she intended. Evalina wanted to free her hand from his grasp, but she knew that all eyes were on them. The Alpha and his Luna. A show for the pack. Still, she couldn't let his words go. You're angry, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a quiet observation. Rhydian didn't slow down, didn't even look at her. His grip, however, tightened just slightly. I wonder why. He replied coldly, his voice sharp enough to cut through her like a blade. Evalina sighed, forcing herself to keep up with his pace. If you're upset about the dress, he cut her off in mid-sentence immediately. Upset. He let out a low, humorless laugh. Do you just accept gifts from anyone, even when you have a husband? He asked, making Evalina flinch. She knew he meant for his words to sting, but it still took her breath away. She clenched her jaw, swallowing the ache in her throat. Tobias is my friend. Rhydian scoffed. He's my beta. Evalina stopped walking, and Rhydian, despite being halfway down the staircase, was forced to stop with her. For the first time since Lyra's little performance upstairs, Evalina turned fully toward him. Her dress pooled around her feet, her breathing steady, but her heart was another matter entirely. She tilted her chin, meeting his gaze. Would you have preferred I wore nothing? She whispered. Rhydian's eyes flashed. For a single second, a breathless, charged second, Evalina thought she saw something darken in his expression. Something possessive. But then, his jaw clenched and turned his head away from her. She took a slow breath and whispered. Of course, no reply. It's not like my husband cares about what I wear. Rhydian tensed beside her. Evalina didn't wait for a response. She lifted her chin and descended the last few steps with quiet grace, masking the storm inside her. By the time they reached the ballroom, the facade was back in place. A Luna, an Alpha, a marriage for peace. That was all. And yet, as the doors swung open, revealing a grand ballroom filled with werewolves, the golden chandeliers casting a soft, ethereal glow over them, Evalina could still feel the lingering warmth of his fingers entwined with hers. The moment Rhydian and Evalina stepped into the grand ballroom, the air shifted. The soft hum of conversation ceased. Every gaze in the room, werewolves, warriors, elders turned toward them. Evalina felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her. Like, she knew what they were thinking. A human Luna. A foreigner in their world. She clenched her fingers against the fabric of her dress, keeping her posture straight. She wouldn't let them see her unease. But it wasn't their stares that sent a chill down her spine. It was Lyra's. From across the room, Lyra stood at the heart of a group of high-ranking werewolves, her hand elegantly wrapped around a glass of wine. She was a vision to every man standing in the ball, with the deep neckline exposing just enough to tease the imagination. Her dark hair was swept up, revealing the delicate slope of her neck, her skin glowing under the soft lights. She looked like she belonged there, like a queen standing among her people watching Rhydian, waiting for his eyes to find her. But for the first time, they didn't. His focus was elsewhere on the woman beside him. Evalina. Lyra's grip on her glass tightened. Before she could dwell on it, a voice cut through the tension. Princess Evalina. There was only one person who called her princess. The moment Evalina heard the familiar voice, she knew it was none other than Tobias. Evalina turned just as Tobias stepped forward, dressed black coat adorned with silver embroidery. The fabric fit him perfectly, emphasizing his broad shoulders and lean frame. His golden brown hair was slightly tousled, like he hadn't tried too hard, though she knew better. Tobias was always put together, confident and relaxed, his hazel eyes filled with warmth as he greeted her. But when her gaze shifted from him to Rhydian, her breath hitched. The Alpha was an entirely different force. Rhydian wore a deep, obsidian red-black suit, the fine tailoring emphasizing his powerful frame. The high collar and silver-threaded details added a regal, authoritative air. Unlike Tobias's easy grace, Rhydian exuded raw strength. His silver eyes are cold and piercings are sharp enough to cut through steel. His dark hair was ruthlessly styled, not a single strand out of place, and his chiseled features were unreadable, save for the flicker of something dark beneath the surface. Standing side by side, Tobias and Rhydian couldn't have been more different. "You look beautiful, princess," Tobias said, grinning as his eyes swept over her gown with clear appreciation. The warmth in his voice settled over her like a comforting embrace. Evalina smiled softly, grateful for the small reprieve from the thick tension suffocating the room. But before she could respond, a low, warning growl filled the space. The warmth vanished. Tobias's smirk remained, but his posture shifted just slightly, like he was bracing himself. Rhydian's grip on Evalina's hand tightened. "She's a Luna," Rhydian said, his voice like steel. Tobias simply raised an eyebrow. "So?" Rhydian's jaw clenched. "She is the Luna of this pack. You will address her as such, and you will bow when you greet her." Evalina's breath caught. He had never demanded that of anyone before. Not once since she arrived, but before she could say anything, Tobias sighed dramatically, placing a hand over his chest. "My deepest apologies," he drawled, before sweeping into an exaggerated bow. Evalina couldn't help it. She laughed. A small, breathy sound that escaped before she could stop it. Rhydian's gaze snapped to her with unreadable expressions, but she swore she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Jealousy? No. That was impossible. Still, she turned to him, her voice soft but firm. "It's fine," she murmured, meeting his gaze. "I don't like my friends bowing to me," she continued. "And I don't mind being called princess. It truly feels like home, as Tobias said earlier this morning." The moment the words left her lips, Rhydian's entire expression changed. His fingers twitched at his sides, his shoulders going rigid. He looked at her as if she had just struck him, like she had said something he wasn't prepared to hear. But before she could ask why, a voice rang through the ballroom. "Alpha and Luna. The first dance belongs to you." Evalina swallowed. This was it. Without another word, Rhydian reached for her hand. His grip was firm, unrelenting, and Evalina had no choice but to follow him to the center of the room. The moment they stepped onto the floor, The room fell into a hushed silence, and the music began. Rhydian's hand settled on her waist, his touch burning even through the fabric of her dress. Too close, too warm, too much. But she couldn't falter. Not here. Not now. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. His silver eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Then he moved. Evalina barely had time to react before he swept her into the first step of the waltz. His movements were flawless, commanding. It took every ounce of concentration to match his pace. "Relax, you look like you're preparing for battle," he murmured, his breath brushing against her ear. Evalina swallowed hard, refusing to acknowledge the way his nearness made her pulse race. "This is a battle for me, because I'm the only one surrounded by wolves here," she whispered back, her voice barely carrying over the soft melody. His lips twitched, almost a smirk, almost something else, but this time, he did not let the silence settle and said, "No matter how many wolves surround you, Evalina, no one would dare to lay a hand on you, not as long as I'm with you." Her breath hitched as he said it, with his voice was low. It's as if it meant only for her ears. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. Firm, certain, as if it were a promise etched into stone. Something inside her wavered, a part of her that had been bracing for cold indifference and nothing more. But this was different. Her heart betrayed her, hammering against her ribs as her gaze locked with his. Has his hold always been this gentle? Has his eyes always been this piercing? She had spent so long believing he despised this marriage that she had no place beside him. But now, standing in his arms, with his hand pressed against the small of her back, fingers laced with hers, she saw something else, something deeper in his eyes. And so did he. His gaze flickered downward, to her lips. Evalina's breath came fast, uneven, as he tilted her chin slightly, his grip tightening ever so slightly on her waist. He was going to. Just then the music stopped. A sharp wave of applause crashed over them, the spell shattering into 1,000 pieces. Her lungs burned as if she had forgotten how to breathe. "Alpha," Lyra called. The single word from Lyra cut through the space between them, sharp as a blade. Evalina barely had a second to gather herself before Rhydian pulled away completely, his touch vanishing like it had never been there. Rhydian tensed, his face smoothing into indifference, so quickly that Evalina nearly questioned if the last few moments had been real. But she knew they were, because she had felt it. Lyra stood just beyond them, looking at them, smiling. Lyra's voice sliced through the tension, smooth as silk but laced with quiet demand. "Shall we, Alpha?" Her lips curved into a knowing smile as she extended her delicate hand toward Rhydian. Her dark eyes flickered with certainty. She knew he wouldn't refuse. Evalina forced herself to remain still, ignoring the tightening in her chest. Rhydian stared at Lyra's outstretched hand for a moment too long. His jaw set, his fingers flexing at his sides. Evalina held her breath as she knew he was about to take it suddenly, a voice break through them. "A dance, princess?" The voice was smooth, confident, and came from right beside her. "Tobias." Evalina turned her head to find him standing beside her. She knew what he was doing. He was offering her an escape, a shield, a choice. Lyra's gaze flickered to the beta, her lips parting slightly in surprise, as if she hadn't considered anyone else would dare interrupt this moment. Evalina hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. Rhydian's silver gaze snapped to Tobias, his entire body stiffening. And that's when she saw it. Possession. His hand twitched at his side, as if stopping himself from reaching for her. But he didn't stop, and that was enough. So Evalina forced a smile and placed her hand in Tobias's outstretched palm. The beta's fingers curled around hers, firm but reassuring. Lyra's smirk widened as she turned back to Rhydian, tilting her head in expectation. "Come on, Alpha. It wouldn't be right to refuse me, would it?" The moment stretched. The air felt heavier. But then Rhydian turned his back on her, causing Lyra to freeze. The murmur of the crowd around them dimmed, whispers threading through the room as gasps of shock rippled through the guests. Evalina wasn't sure who was more stunned, Lyra or herself. Lyra's hand trembled before she quickly pulled it back, her fingers curling into a fist to her side. The look on her face was something Evalina had never seen before, raw, humiliated fury. But Rhydian didn't glance back at her. Instead, he strode forward, past Evalina and Tobias, the briefest graze of his hand against the fabric of her dress sending shivers to her whole body. And then, just as suddenly, he was gone. Lyra stood there, stiff and silent, before a slow, icy smile curved her lips. She turned back toward Evalina. Evalina braced herself, but Lyra said nothing. Instead, she spun on her heel and disappeared into the crowd furiously. Evalina exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then, Tobias gave her hand a slight squeeze, drawing her attention back to him. "Looks like it's just you and me then, princess," Tobias said, and Evalina laughed, shaking her head. And just like that, the music started again. Two figures stepped onto the floor. From the far end of the ballroom, Rhydian leaned against the grand marble pillar, a crystal glass of amber liquid swirling in his grip. He wasn't drinking, not really, just holding as his silver gaze was locked onto the dance floor. Onto them. Evalina and Tobias moved together in effortless harmony, the beta's easy smile never faltering as he twirled her, his hand firm on her waist. She laughed at something he said, the sound soft and warm, so different from the tense, cold air that had surrounded her all evening. Rhydian's grip tightened around the glass. His wolf, Driven, growled low inside his head. "You let him touch what's yours." Rhydian exhaled through his nose, jaw ticking. Tobias was too close. His palm lingered too long on his wife's waist, and his words were too soft. And Evalina, she was smiling at him, a genuine, bright thing, like she had finally found something to anchor herself to in this foreign world. Something that wasn't him. Something that should have been him. Just then, a delicate hand slid over his forearm. Lyra. She stepped closer with her painted lips curled into a knowing smile. "You humiliated me out there, Rhydian. Tell me, why won't you dance with me?" she asked, tilting her head as her fingers traced idle circles on his wrist. His gaze remained on Evalina, watching as Tobias whispered something in her ear, drawing yet another quiet laugh from her lips. Something snapped. Rhydian turned sharply to Lyra, grabbing her wrist, not painfully, but enough to keep her in place. His voice was low, steady. "Dangerous. Because I don't want to," he answered coldly. Lyra's eyes flashed with disbelief. "You." But he wasn't finished and continued. "Look, we might be fated mates, Lyra, but I could do nothing but reject you right now." Her lips parted slightly, a sharp inhale drawn between them. "I am married, and I will take my pack forward by giving it an heir with my wife." Rhydian said his tone was like steel. Lyra's nails dug into his wrist, eyes widening, her perfectly crafted mask cracking as she asked, "Are you serious?" Rhydian released her hand, straightening. She let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You're going to have a child with a human?" Rhydian sighed as he looked at her and answered, "I will do what is necessary." Lyra's breath came faster, her eyes burning with disbelief. "You don't love her," she said, but he turned away from her and looked at his wife still smiling in Tobias' arms. "Love has nothing to do with it. I have a duty. Accept my rejection, Lyra, and stay away from me," he replied with a detachment. Lyra clenched her jaw, fury flashing through her eyes. "You're making a mistake." He didn't respond. He turned on his heel, his presence towering and commanding as he left her standing alone. Lyra watched him go, her fingers trembling with rage before she curled them into a fist. "No." He could try to cast her aside, but she wouldn't let him. Her gaze darkened, shifting back to the dance floor where Evalina still twirled in Tobias's arms, smiling, glowing under the candle-lit chandeliers. "I won't accept your rejection," she said to herself. A slow, malicious smile curved her lips. "I will make sure your wife meets her end, Rhydian. And when she's gone, I will be the one to bear your heir. I will be your Luna." Lyra promised herself, looking cunningly at Evalina. How far will Lyra go to remove Evalina from her path? With jealousy burning in her veins, will she succeed in making Rhydian hers? Is Tobias simply being a loyal friend, or is there something deeper behind his affection? Could his playful charm hide real feelings, or is he just drawn to Evalina because of the distance between her and Rhydian? Will Rhydian's possessiveness turn into true love, or is he only bound by duty? When danger comes for Evalina, will he fight for her as lunar as the woman he can't live without? Comment down for part 2. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel.